for tat basically lasts from July 7th up until July 31st. I would argue this past Friday. The Iranians and the Americans are going back and forth, not every day, but almost every day between July 7th and July 31st. And then what happens on the 30th and on the 31st is President Trump begins to talk about going back to an indiscriminate air campaign. He's basically once again talking about driving the Iranians back into the Stone Age. People this past weekend, this is August 1st, we're August 2nd, thinking that maybe President Trump is going to launch this indiscriminate air campaign. But what happens is, at the end of the day, on August 1st, he says that's not going to happen. Let's go back to negotiations. Right? So you remember, at the end of the 40-day bombing campaign, he had threatened to drive a whole civilization to its death. Remember, that's his rhetoric back then. He was talking back then about driving the Iranians back to the Stone Age as well. And here he is again doing that. And in both cases, he didn't go that far. And in fact, what he did was the next day, he called for a ceasefire the first time, April 8th, and this time he said, let's go back to negotiations, which is another way of saying I think that he's interested now in another ceasefire so that he can negotiate. So that's my description of what happened. Now, what we want to do is we want to analyze what happened, and we want to pay very careful attention to why the discriminate air campaign, the blockade, and the tit for tat all failed. Those three strategies were all failed. If you listen carefully to what I said, we went from discriminate air campaign to blockade to tit for tat. But we did not contemplate or move toward the land option, and we want to talk about why that's the case, nor did President Trump ever go to an indiscriminate air campaign, although he threatened it, as I tried to make clear. And we want to know why he didn't do either of those two, or employ either of those two strategies. Okay. So let's go to the discriminate air campaign, the 40-day campaign. Truth is, it just didn't work. There was no evidence as that campaign wore on that the Iranians were going to throw up their hands and surrender. The shock and awe campaign, the decapitation strategy, which came at the beginning, didn't work. And we continued to bomb. Most estimates say that the United States hit over 13,000 targets. You want to think about that. This is not the Israelis. We can't get a good number for the Israelis. But the Americans alone hit 13,000 plus targets in that 40-day campaign. This is a strategic bombing campaign. But the Iranians were not showing any signs of quitting. Furthermore, the Iranians made it perfectly clear during that campaign that they had the ability to retaliate. And retaliate they did. And they were inflicting massive punishment on American bases in the region, on America's Gulf state allies, and on Israel itself. So the Iranians were doing quite well for themselves in the fight. And all the time this is happening, people are deeply worried that if the war goes on and on and on like this, that, number one, the United States is going to run out of munitions because we only have a limited number of offensive munitions and defensive munitions to protect ourselves, our allies, and the Israelis against incoming ballistic missiles from Iran. So the inventory of offensive and defensive weapons is being run down. The Iranians show no signs of quitting. And furthermore, they are retaliating in serious ways that threaten the world economy. So what does President Trump do? What President Trump does as we move towards the end of the 40-day war is that he threatens to go to an indiscriminate air campaign. Just think about that. He's thinking about going to an indiscriminate air campaign. He's talking about bombing the Iranians back to the Stone Age because the discriminate air campaign has failed. And he sees this as the best alternative. But what happens is he does not pursue that strategy. He does not. What he does is, after threatening to wipe out the Iranian civilization, he then, the next day, declares a ceasefire. A ceasefire. He doesn't go up the escalation ladder. And the question you want to ask yourself is, why doesn't he do this? And the reason he doesn't do this is because the United States does not have escalation dominance. We've learned this in the 40-day war. The fact is that if President Trump goes to an indiscriminate campaign, that means he's going to hit bridges, he's going to hit power plants, he's going to hit desalination plants inside of Iran, he's going to hit their oil facilities, he's going to destroy their oil and gas facilities. The Iranians make it clear they're going to do the same thing to all the Gulf states. And they're going to do a lot of the same thing to Israel itself. And President Trump understands full well he cannot prevent this. He understands that as he goes up the escalation ladder, the Iranians will go up the escalation ladder with him. And you want to remember that if, in the event this were to happen, and the Iranians were to destroy all of those desalination plants in the Gulf states and their oil and gas infrastructure, this would have devastating consequences for the international economy. And that's the last thing that President Trump wants to have. So you see, it makes no sense to go up the escalation ladder. This is why an indiscriminate air campaign makes no sense. And it's why the next day, after making those genocidal threats on April 7th, he goes to a ceasefire on the 8th. And the ceasefire is followed by negotiations, as I said, in Islamabad. This is where Vice President Vance meets with Iranian negotiators. That fails, and he has to do something. So what does he do? Does he go back to the air war? No. He sticks with the ceasefire, but he employs a blockade. He employs a blockade, and that starts on April 13th, and it runs until June 17th when you get the Memorandum of Understanding. But the question you want to ask yourself is, what good is the blockade? And the answer is, it's basically no good. It doesn't work. Anybody who's studied blockades understands that blockades, if they ever work, take a long time to work. They take many, many months, if not years, to strangle a country the size of Iran. So it's no accident that between April 13th and June 17th, that's just a little over 2 months, we've made very little progress in causing the Iranians to throw up their hands and say, I quit. Therefore, having failed with the air war, and that's the discriminate air campaign, being unwilling to go to an indiscriminate air campaign, having failed with the blockade, on June 17th, President Trump signs the Memorandum of Understanding. And as I made clear at the top of the show, that's a surrender document. Okay, after President Trump signs that agreement, he can't bring himself to stick to it. The thought of the United States losing, the thought of Donald Trump losing a war that he started to Iran is just unacceptable. So he begins to challenge, to undermine the Memorandum of Understanding. He begins to look for ways to put pressure on the Iranians, again, to get the Iranians to throw their hands up. And this is the start of the tit-for-tat campaign, right? As I said to you, as soon as the Americans established this channel in the Strait of Hormuz, contrary to what's in Article 5 of the Memorandum of Understanding. The Iranians start shooting at ships that are going through that channel. We retaliate with air attacks, and the Iranians then retaliate against us, and of course we retaliate, they retaliate, and we're going up the escalation ladder. But it's just tit for tat. And what you want to understand here is that a tit for tat air strategy is much less ambitious than that strategic bombing campaign that we waged during the first 40 days of the conflict. And you just say to yourself, if that strategic bombing campaign, even though it was a discriminating bombing campaign, one that discriminated in terms of the targets, it was still a substantial bombing campaign. 13,000 plus targets by the United States alone. If that, right, couldn't bring the Iranians to their knees, why would anybody think that a tit-for-tat strategy is going to bring the Iranians to their knees? And in fact, it didn't. And in fact, the tit-for-tat strategy was causing the United States huge problems. In fact, we were beginning to move our military assets out of the Persian Gulf back to Jordan and back to Israel. And what did the Iranians do? They started targeting Jordan. And they were doing substantial damage to American military assets in Jordan, which is outside the Persian Gulf. All of this just shows you that escalation dominance, whether you're talking about the discriminate air campaign or the indiscriminate air campaign, or you're talking about tit for tat, you go up the escalation ladder in either of those three cases, and it's not clear that America wins. And in fact, it's clear to me that Iran wins. So the end result is that President Trump, late on Saturday, this is August 1st, I believe it was August 2nd, in Iran, said, I'm not going to try to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age. And what we now have to do is we have to go back to negotiations. Now, keep in mind here that there were two strategies that we never employed. We never employed the indiscriminate air campaign, number one, and I explained why that was the case. We do not have escalation dominance as you go up the escalation ladder to that level, right? And then we did not pursue a land campaign. And let me say a few words about that. To actually conquer the Strait of Hormuz, I believe would involve more than 100,000 troops. It would involve a huge fighting force, and many Americans would die in the process. There is no way that President Trump is willing to do that. In fact, there's no way the American people would tolerate that, which of course is one of the reasons that President Trump never went down that road. We would need, in other words, a good 100,000 combat troops, maybe 150,000 combat troops in the Persian Gulf to conquer enough territory to control the Strait of Hormuz. And if you were talking about conquering all of Iran the way we conquered all of Ukraine, the way we conquered all of Iraq in 2003, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of troops. That was not going to happen. We were not going to try to conquer all of Iran. We were not even going to try to conquer enough territory to control the Strait of Hormuz. So what people ended up doing was talking about conquering an island or two in the Persian Gulf that belonged to Iran. But President Trump was not even willing to do that. And if you look at the number of combat troops that we had in the Persian Gulf, it's quite clear that we were never serious about even trying the land option. I would estimate that at the most we had 8,000 combat troops, 8,000 troops that you could use for land attack in the Persian Gulf at any point since February 28th. And 8,000 troops trying to conquer even an island in the Persian Gulf against the Iranians in the heat of the summer would be an almost impossible task. But furthermore, what if we did conquer an island? What would be the result? What's the story that one might tell about how conquering an island puts an end to this war? How does conquering an island get the Iranians to throw their hands up? The answer is it doesn't. We have no land option here. We don't have the troops. We don't have the stomach for a land war. And a minor attack on an island or landing somewhere on the coast of Iran has little effect on the outcome of the war. So there's no land option, number one. Number two, there's no indiscriminate air option. Strategic bombing of an indiscriminate sort going against the entire target set inside of Iran, that doesn't work either. So you're left with three strategies: a discriminate air campaign, which we tried and failed; a blockade, which we tried and failed; tit for tat, which we tried and failed. And here we are. So the question is, what do we do moving forward? Well, it seems manifestly clear to me that we've tried all the strategies that are available, and they have not worked, unsurprisingly. And the two strategies that we have not tried are not a solution to the problem. And to go back to the goals, we have failed to achieve any of our goals up to this point. It's manifestly clear when you look at the Memorandum of Understanding signed on June 17th. And when you just think about where we are today in terms of those goals and in terms of who controls the strait and what's happened to our basing structure, what's happened to our alliance structure in the Gulf, it's clear that we've lost. We have failed to achieve our goals, and worse. And this is reflected in the June 17th Memorandum of Understanding. As I said to you, if you look carefully at that memorandum, it's a surrender document. So what is President Trump going to do now? Now, I would point out that when it comes to President Trump, you can never be absolutely certain what he will do. And in a situation where he's desperate, and he is desperate because he is surely sophisticated enough to know that he is in deep trouble in this war and that he has in effect lost the war. So he may lash out and he may do something foolish. But assuming that's not the case, he really has no choice at this point but to pursue another memorandum of understanding, to try to get a deal with the Iranians as quickly as possible. I want to point out two things here. One is President Trump would have been much better off cutting a deal immediately after the April 8th ceasefire. When the bombing campaign failed, the discriminate air campaign failed. On April 8th, he moved to a ceasefire. He should have then tried to cut a deal. Furthermore, when the blockade failed and he signed the Memorandum of Understanding on June 17th, he should have stuck to that Memorandum of Understanding, and he should have gone to great lengths to work out a deal with Iran to put an end to the war. But as I told you, he didn't do that. Instead, he tried to violate Article 5 of the Memorandum of Understanding. We got in this tit-for-tat strategy for almost the entire month of July. It failed. And now, I'm telling you, it's time to cut a deal, although I'm arguing that it would have been smarter to cut the deal earlier. One final point on this is that it's going to be tougher to get a Memorandum of Understanding from the Iranians moving forward that is as good as the Memorandum of Understanding that the President signed on June 17th. The Iranians are more aware than ever that they're in the driver's seat. They're more aware than ever that President Trump is in deep trouble and that he needs an agreement. So they're going to drive a hard bargain, a harder bargain for sure than they drove in the run-up to the June 17th memorandum, and a harder bargain, I believe, than they would have driven back in April after a ceasefire was declared on the 8th. So there's no question that President Trump and the United States is in really deep trouble here, and getting a peace agreement is going to be not an easy task. But the bottom line, and this is where I'll stop, is that President Trump has no choice. He has no military strategy that he can employ to reverse the dire situation that he finds himself in. The fact is, he foolishly started a war on February 28th that he was destined to lose. Many of his advisors understood full well that the strategy that he was employing, this is the discriminated air campaign that I described earlier, was destined to fail, and fail it did. And there was no viable alternative strategy. And there still is no viable alternative strategy. So it's time to cut a deal. But that is not going to be easy for him to do. So let's just hope that things work out, that in the month or months ahead, he's able to put an end to this war once and for all. Thank you very much for listening to my video, and I look forward to the next one.